The morning whistle cut through Flint's January air at 5:30 a.m., same as it had every weekday for 32 years. Brian Nichols didn't need an alarm clock anymore. His body knew when to rise, when to shower, when to eat his toast standing up at the kitchen counter. His hands knew exactly how many turns to give his thermos cap, how to tie his boots without looking. The ritual felt as permanent as his own heartbeat. The snow crunched under his tires as he pulled into the Buick City parking lot. Row after row of American steel, breath clouding from warm exhaust pipes. Fisher body plan on his left, engine assembly on his right, the complex spreading across the frozen landscape like its own civilization. Brian found his spot, not officially assigned but understood by everyone to be his, and killed the engine. He sat for a moment, watching workers streaming toward the gates, lunch pails swinging, cigarette embers glowing in the pre-dawn darkness. The smell hit him as he walked through the gate. Hot metal, oil, sweat, coffee, cigarettes. The smell of security. The smell of Flint. Nichols. Tom Harding waved from the time clock. Heard anything? Brian punched his card. About what? Rumors going around. Something big coming down from Detroit. Always rumors, Brian said, shrugging into his coveralls. Remember when they said they were closing Fisher too? That was 1974. Still running. The assembly line beckoned, a mechanical river flowing through the cavernous building. Brian took his position between Frank Dempsey and Walt Harris, men he'd stood beside for more years than some of these younger guys had been alive. His hands found the familiar tools, body automatically leaning to accommodate the car frames sliding past. My cousin works corporate in Detroit, Walt said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the machinery. Says they're talking Mexico. Building a whole new plant down there. Brian's hands continued working, tightening, adjusting, checking, while his mind dismissed the idea. General Motors was Flint. 10 plants. 80,000 jobs. Half the city directly employed, the other half dependent on those who were. His father had worked the line before him. His son Bobby was in skilled trades at truck assembly. 3 generations of Nichols' men had built America's cars. They can't build Buicks in Mexico, Brian said. Americans wouldn't buy them. Walt didn't argue. They all knew the truth. GM was Flint, and Flint was GM. The company's stores still stood downtown. Durant had founded the place here. The sit-down strike of '37 had happened right in this plant. History had been written on these concrete floors. The shift ended at 3:30. Brian clocked out, showered in the locker room, and drove home to the house on Flushing Road he'd bought in 1968, $17,000 on a 30-year mortgage. Tanya would have dinner ready. She'd worked at AC Spark Plug until Bobby was born, then again once he started school. A 2-income GM family, the Flint dream. He pulled into the driveway beside Tanya's Oldsmobile Cutlass, employee discount, and noticed Bobby's truck already there. Unusual for a Thursday. Tanya Nichols met him at the door. 30 years of marriage had softened her face, but not her eyes. Those still flashed with the same determination that had caught his attention at the UAW dance in 1956. Bobby's here, she said, voice tight. Something's happening. Their son sat at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes. At 28, he looked like Brian had at the same age, broad shoulders, thick hands, permanent line of grime under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. But today, his face held something Brian didn't recognize. Fear. They announced it this afternoon, Bobby said without preamble. They're closing Fisher Body after the summer. 2,000 jobs. Brian hung his coat slowly. Moving it where? Gone. Just gone. Some of the work's going to Fort Wayne, some to Mexico. That's not possible, Brian said automatically. Fisher's been running since 1947. But even as he said it, something cold formed in the pit of his stomach. For months, no, years, there had been signs. The Japanese cars showing up in Flint driveways. The white-collar guys from Detroit with their clipboards and efficiency studies. The quiet disappearance of third shifts. It's happening, Dad, Bobby said. Plant manager had us all in the big room. Told us to start thinking about our options. Tanya's hand found Brian's shoulder. Sit down and eat, she said. We'll figure it out. But that night, lying beside Tanya in the darkness, Brian couldn't sleep. Fisher was just one plant. His job at Buick City was secure. But the cold feeling wouldn't leave his stomach. 2,000 jobs. That was 2,000 families, 2,000 mortgages, 2,000 futures suddenly uncertain. "We'll be fine," he whispered to Tanya, unsure if she was awake. Her hand found his in the darkness. "I know," she said, though he heard the doubt. The next morning, Brian drove to work through a city that suddenly looked different. The same streets, the same buildings, but now he saw them with new eyes. The bars and restaurants that filled with GM workers at shift change. The stores where people spent GM paychecks. The schools built with GM tax dollars. The neighborhoods filled with GM families. If Fisher could close, what else could? The question followed him into the plant, hung over him as he worked the line. At lunch, it dominated conversation in the break room. "Just Fisher for now," Frank said around a mouthful of sandwich. "But I heard engine ops is next." "My cousin says Buick City will be fine," Walt insisted. "We're the flagship. They're not touching us." Brian wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. His pension was still 8 years away. That weekend, Brian and Tanya drove downtown to shop. Flint had been losing retail to the new malls on the outskirts, but they still liked the downtown stores. As they walked past the hulking brick building that had once been the GM administrative headquarters before the company moved operations to Detroit, Brian realized he'd been seeing the signs for years, but choosing to ignore them. "Remember when they moved the headquarters?" he asked Tanya. She nodded. 1980. Everyone said it was just consolidation. Made sense. But it was the beginning, wasn't it? She squeezed his hand. "Don't borrow trouble, Brian. One day at a time." Spring came. The snow melted, revealing months of grime on Flint streets. The papers reported GM's profits were up, but so was competition. The UAW was negotiating, fighting to save Fisher, but everyone knew it was a lost cause. Fisher would close in August. Then came July 1st, 1986. Brian was at his station when the line stopped. An unusual occurrence in the middle of a shift. The plant manager appeared on the catwalk above them, flanked by men in suits no one recognized. "Can I have your attention?" he called, voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I need everyone to gather in the meeting room." Immediately, a cold sweat broke across Brian's back. In 32 years, he'd never been called off the line mid-shift for an announcement. 1,200 workers filed into the cavernous room, standing shoulder to shoulder. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The suits told the story. As part of General Motors' restructuring initiative, the plant manager began. "The corporation has made some difficult decisions regarding our operations in Flint." Brian felt the floor tilt beneath him. Beginning in January 1987, Buick City production will be reduced by 60%. This will necessitate the elimination of approximately 3,000 positions. The room erupted. Shouts, curses, questions. Brian stood rooted, unable to move, unable to process what he'd just heard. 60%. 3,000 jobs. His job. His life. Workers will be offered options based on seniority. The manager continued over the noise. Buyouts, early retirement for those eligible, or possible relocation to other facilities. Relocation. The word hung in the air like smoke. Leave Flint. The city where he was born, where his parents were buried, where his son was raising his grandchildren. Someone pushed past Brian toward the exit. Then another. He found himself moving with the crowd, back toward the line, but the supervisors were already there, telling them to clear out their lockers, that the line was shut down for the day. Brian drove home in a fog. Tanya was at work at AC Spark Plug. The house was empty. He sat at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The phone rang. It was Bobby. "Did you hear?" His voice was tight. "Truck assembly just announced. They're cutting a shift in October." Brian closed his eyes. "I know. Buick City too. Big cuts coming." "Jesus, Dad. What are we going to do?" What were they going to do? Brian had asked himself that question only once before in his adult life, when he was 18 and his father had asked if he wanted to work at GM after high school. The answer then had been obvious. Of course. Good pay, good benefits, job security, respect. A man who built things with his hands could raise a family, buy a home, take a vacation, send his kids to college. "I don't know," Brian admitted. "I need to talk to your mother." That night, Tanya cried. Brian had seen her cry only 3 times before, when they married, when Bobby was born, and when her father died. Now she sat at their kitchen table, shoulders shaking silently as Brian told her the news. "I have 32 years in," he said. "They'll have to offer me something." A buyout maybe. And then what? Tanya asked, wiping her eyes. You're 50. What will you do for the next 15 years? It was a question without an answer. Brian had never been anything but a GM man. His identity, his pride, his sense of place in the world, all of it came from his work. From building cars that people drove across America. From being part of something bigger than himself. The summer of 1986 passed in a haze of uncertainty. Every week brought new announcements. GM would cut 29,000 jobs nationwide. Fisher Body would close completely in August. Buick City would see drastic reductions. Truck assembly would lose its third shift. The mood in Flint changed. In the bars where workers had once gathered after shifts to celebrate birthdays or retirements, men now sat in grim silence, nursing beers they could no longer easily afford. For sale signs appeared in front yards. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Housing prices began to fall. Stores closed. August came. Fisher Body shut its doors for the last time. 2,000 workers, gone. Some took transfers to plants in other states. Some took buyouts. Some simply had nothing. In September, Brian was called into the personnel office. The woman behind the desk had papers ready. Mr. Nichols, based on your seniority, we can offer you 3 options, she said, sliding the papers across to him. A transfer to our Lordstown, Ohio plant. A buyout of $45,000. Or, given your age and years of service, an early retirement package. Early retirement. At 50. With a reduced pension that would barely cover the mortgage. How long do I have to decide? Brian asked. 2 weeks, the woman said, not unkindly. I'm sorry, Mr. Nichols. I know this is difficult. That night, Brian and Tanya sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before them, calculating, recalculating, trying to make the numbers work. We could sell the house, Tanya suggested. Move somewhere cheaper. Nobody's buying, Brian said. Every day there's another for sale sign. What about Lordstown? We could start over. Brian looked at his wife, at the home they'd built over 30 years. The thought of leaving, of admitting defeat, made his chest tight. This is our home, he said. Our whole life is here. But even as he said it, he looked around the kitchen and realized something was changing. The home he'd been so proud to buy, the life he'd built with such certainty, it had all been balanced on a foundation he believed was permanent. GM had been Flint's bedrock. His bedrock. Now that bedrock was crumbling. I'll take the retirement, he decided. The pension's not great, but with your income, we can make it work until you're eligible too. Tanya nodded, reaching for his hand. We'll figure it out. October 15th, 1986. Brian's last day. He parked in his usual spot, walked through the gate one final time. The smell hit him. Metal, oil, sweat. And for a moment he was 20 again, following his father through these same doors, heart pounding with pride and possibility. The line was already running at half capacity. Empty stations where men had once stood. Robots now handled some operations, silent, efficient machines that never complained, never took breaks, never needed pensions. His co-workers had arranged a small gathering in the break room. A cake from the Kroger bakery, coffee in paper cups, handshakes and backslaps from men he'd spent more time with than his own family. 32 years, Frank said, raising his coffee cup. Hell of a run, Brian. Remember the 72 Riviera? Walt added. Best damn car GM ever made. We built that. They had. They'd built millions of cars that carried families across America, that witnessed first dates and vacations and funerals and births. They'd built a middle-class life for themselves in the process. They'd built Flint. At the end of the day, Brian clocked out for the last time. He stood for a moment, watching the line continue its relentless motion. Then he walked to his locker, emptied it into a cardboard box, and walked out through the gate. The security guard nodded to him. Take care, Mr. Nichols. Brian placed the box in his trunk and sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't ready to go home. Instead, he drove through Flint streets slowly, seeing the city with new eyes. The neighborhoods around the plants had always been solid, proud places. Small, neat houses with trimmed lawns, American cars in the driveways. Now they looked tired. Paint peeling, lawns overgrown. For sale signs, empty driveways. Downtown, stores were closing. Everything must go signs and windows that had once displayed the latest fashions, the newest appliances. The restaurants where he and Tanya had celebrated anniversaries were empty, at dinner time. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about GM. It was about a way of life that was disappearing before his eyes. He drove to the Flint River, parked at Riverbank Park, and walked along the water. His father had brought him here as a child to fish. He'd brought Bobby here too. The river had been dirty then, industrial waste from the plants upstream, but no one had minded much. It was the price of prosperity. Now the river flowed cleaner, but the prosperity was leaving. Winter came. Brian struggled to fill his days. He'd never had free time before, always working overtime, always busy with house projects on weekends. Now the empty hours stretched before him like the empty parking lots at the plants. He tried to help Bobby, who was fighting to hold on to his job at truck assembly. The plant was down to a single shift. Every day brought rumors of more cuts. They're saying they might close it entirely, Bobby told him over Sunday dinner in December. Move everything to Texas. Brian had no wisdom to offer, no reassurances. The certainties he'd built his life around were gone. In January 1987, GM announced another 5,000 job cuts in Flint. By spring, unemployment in the city hit 20%. Houses that had sold for $50,000 5 years earlier now sat empty or sold for half that. Crime rose. People left. Brian watched it all with a growing sense of loss. Not just for his job, for his identity, but for the city itself, for the promise it had represented. We should think about leaving too, Tanya suggested one night. My sister in Grand Rapids says they're hiring at the furniture factory. Brian looked at her in surprise. Tanya had been born in Flint, had never lived anywhere else. You'd leave? He asked. She looked around their kitchen, eyes lingering on the window above the sink where she could see the empty house next door, the for sale sign that had been there for 8 months. I don't think this is getting better, Brian, she said softly. I think this is just the beginning. She was right. Through the spring and summer of 1987, the exodus continued. More plants reduced shifts. More jobs disappeared. More families packed up and left. In August, AC Spark Plug, where Tanya worked, announced a 30% reduction. Her job was safe for now, but the writing was on the wall. That fall, Brian began volunteering at a food bank downtown. The lines grew longer each week. He recognized faces. Men he'd worked with, neighbors, people who'd once had steady jobs and secure futures. Never thought I'd be here, a former Fisher Body worker told him as Brian handed him a box of groceries. 26 years on the line, and now I can't feed my kids. Brian nodded, unable to find words of comfort. There were no words for what was happening to Flint. One evening in October, Brian attended a city council meeting. The room was packed with angry, frightened people. The city budget was in crisis. Tax revenues were plummeting as businesses closed and property values fell. Services were being cut. Police, fire, garbage collection. What's the plan? Someone shouted from the back. How do we save our city? The council members looked tired, overwhelmed. There was no plan. No one had prepared for this. No one had believed it could happen. As Brian walked to his car afterward, a young reporter from the Flint Journal stopped him. Sir, can I ask why you attended tonight's meeting? Brian looked at her, barely older than his son, notepad in hand, eyes still bright with purpose. I wanted to understand what's happening to my city, he said. And what do you think is happening? Brian looked back at City Hall, at the frustrated people streaming out the doors. I think we believed in something that wasn't real, he said finally. We thought if we worked hard and did everything right, we'd always have security. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. The reporter scribbled his words. Do you blame GM for leaving? Brian considered the question. For months, he'd carried anger toward the company, toward the faceless executives in Detroit who'd decided Flint was expendable. But now, standing in the autumn chill outside City Hall, he felt something different. Something like clarity. GM did what businesses do, he said. They followed the money. The mistake was ours. We built a whole city, a whole way of life, around one company. We never imagined a future without them because we couldn't bear to. That night, Brian couldn't sleep. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Tanya, and went downstairs. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the street was dark, porch lights turned off to save electricity, empty houses standing like gaps in a smile. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where he'd sat thousands of mornings before work, rushing through breakfast, mind already on the day ahead. Now time stretched empty before him. What had his life been about? Building cars? Earning a paycheck? Supporting his family? Yes, all those things. But something else too. Something he'd never articulated because he'd never needed to. His life had been about belonging to something. A company, a city, a tradition, a way of being in the world that made sense. That gave him dignity and purpose. And now that was gone. Not just for him, but for thousands. For the city itself. When morning came, he'd made a decision. He woke Tanya with a cup of coffee and sat on the edge of the bed. I think we should stay, he said. She looked at him, confused. But we haven't decided to go anywhere. I mean in Flint. For good. No matter what happens. Tanya sat up, took the coffee. Why? Because someone has to, Brian said simply. Someone has to remember what this place was. Someone has to help figure out what it can be now. Through the window, they could see the sunrise painting the sky over Flint's east side. The factory whistles no longer marked the day's beginning, too many plants silent now. But the sun still rose. The city still stood. It won't be easy, Tanya said. Brian nodded. I know. It wasn't. 1988 brought more cuts. 1989, more closures. By 1990, GM employment in Flint had fallen from 80,000 to under 30,000. By 1995, to 15,000. Brian watched the transformation with clear eyes. The city struggled, stumbled, fought to reinvent itself. Some neighborhoods emptied. Others hung on. Downtown became a ghost of itself before slowly, painfully beginning to find new purpose. Through it all, Brian and Tanya stayed. They watched friends leave, watched Bobby struggle before finally taking a job in Grand Rapids, watched their grandchildren grow up visiting Flint rather than living there. They watched their property value fall until their house was worth a fraction of what they'd paid. But they also watched new things emerge. Small businesses opened. The university expanded. Artists moved into empty spaces. Young people with no memory of the GM glory days came with fresh ideas, unbound by nostalgia. In 2002, 16 years after Brian's last day at Buick City, the plant was demolished. He stood across the street with hundreds of others, watching as wrecking balls brought down the walls that had contained so much of his life. A young man stood next to him, camera in hand, documenting the demolition. Did you work there? The man asked. Brian nodded. 32 years. The young man shook his head. Must be hard to watch. Brian looked at the crumbling building, felt the rumble of the machinery in his chest. He expected to feel grief, anger, loss. Instead, he felt something unexpected, relief. It's just a building, he said. What mattered was what we built there. The cars, yes, but also the lives. The community. The young man nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of the moment. What happens now? He asked, gesturing to the vast acres that would soon be empty. Brian looked across the landscape of his city, changed, wounded, but still standing. We build something new, he said. Something that can't be moved to Mexico or China. Something that belongs to all of us, not just a company. As the last walls fell, dust rising into the Michigan sky, Brian felt the false certainty he'd lived with for so many years finally release its hold. The belief that had shaped his life, that hard work within the system guaranteed security, had been proven false. But in its place was something truer. The knowledge that worth wasn't measured in cars produced or paychecks earned. It was measured in the ability to face reality, to adapt, to help others through change, to hold on to community when everything else fell away. Flint would never be what it was. Neither would he. But standing in the shadow of his past as it literally crumbled before him, Brian Nichols felt something like peace. The future was unwritten, and for the first time in his life, that no longer frightened him.